The winter of 1878 in Cedar Creek, Indiana, was like any other, cold, bleak, and relentlessly dreary. Yet amid this ordinary winter, a discovery was made by a substitute teacher, Margaret Wilson, that would forever stain the town's history. Margaret, an outsider from Pennsylvania, had taken up the mantle of teaching at the First Methodist Church's Sunday School, a program that was cherished by the community and lauded for its transformative effect on children. Cedar Creek, nestled in the heart of Indiana's coal country, had grown rapidly after the arrival of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in 1871. The town of nearly 3,000 people had become a bustling hub of commerce, its prosperity built on the backs of laborers working in the mines and rail yards. However, it was also a town rife with tension. The arrival of immigrants, particularly Irish and German workers, created a religious divide. The established Protestant community, primarily Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterian, competed for influence and dominance, not just in faith, but in the very fabric of the town's culture. The First Methodist Church stood as the most imposing structure in Cedar Creek, its twin bell towers visible from miles around. Built with Indiana limestone and completed in 1874, it symbolized both religious and cultural ambition. The church's stained glass windows, imported from Cincinnati, gleamed with brilliance, while its steam heating system marked it as a modern marvel in rural Indiana. It became the center of community life, not only as a place of worship, but as an educational institution, thanks to the Sunday school program led by Margaret Wilson. Margaret Wilson had arrived in Cedar Creek 5 years earlier, bringing with her a reputation for discipline and transforming unruly children into exemplary students. A stern, no-nonsense teacher, Margaret commanded respect from all who crossed her path, especially the children she taught. Her background in Pennsylvania's industrial schools, where she had worked with children from the roughest neighborhoods, made her the ideal candidate to lead the Sunday school program. Her methods were simple but effective: strict discipline, high expectations, and an emphasis on biblical study. Under her leadership, the program grew rapidly, with over 200 children from Cedar Creek and surrounding counties participating. Parents, eager for their children to receive an education, particularly one tied to faith, gladly signed their children up. It became a rite of passage for many families, and the promise of special excursions only added to the allure. These excursions were not simple field trips. They were elaborate, week-long journeys that took children to biblical sites across Indiana and surrounding states. Visits to historical churches, archaeological digs, and meetings with prominent Methodist educators became regular highlights of the program. The town buzzed with excitement whenever a new trip was announced, and families eagerly vied to send their children, seeing it as an opportunity for both religious education and upward mobility. Margaret Wilson's assistant, Sarah Coleman, was equally revered. A soft-spoken woman of 38, Sarah possessed a gift for calming even the most unruly child. Her background, too, was impressive. She had come from a Methodist mission in Cincinnati, where she had worked with orphan children. Though not as outwardly forceful as Margaret, Sarah's quiet dedication and her ability to connect with children earned her the respect of the community. Together, Margaret and Sarah made a powerful duo. They formed the backbone of the Sunday school program, with Margaret overseeing the educational aspects and Sarah providing the emotional care. Their success was undeniable, and the program became central to the life of Cedar Creek. The first disappearance was in September 1876. 8-year-old Timothy Morrison, an intelligent, quiet boy, was selected for a special excursion to study biblical archaeology in Louisville. His parents, recent immigrants from Germany, were overjoyed at the opportunity for their son. Timothy had demonstrated exceptional abilities in memorizing scripture, and Margaret Wilson saw in him a child destined for greater things. His parents, struggling with language barriers and financial hardships, saw this as a rare chance to give their son a future that they themselves could not provide. The Morrison family, proud and grateful, saw Timothy off with hopeful hearts, believing that their son was on the path to something greater. Margaret had promised to send regular reports on Timothy's progress, and for a time the letters continued. But then, months passed without any communication. Margaret explained that the child was too immersed in his studies to write, that he was deeply focused on his research. But as the months wore on, the Morrison family, along with the town, began to notice that Timothy was not the only child who had disappeared. The first few instances were written off as unfortunate but inevitable in a town where children from immigrant families were particularly vulnerable. The next disappearance occurred just 2 weeks later. 10-year-old Mary Catherine Phillips, a bright and outgoing girl, disappeared without a trace after being sent on an excursion to work with frontier missions in Illinois. As the list of missing children grew, Margaret continued to offer plausible, even admirable explanations for their absences. She spoke of the children's immersion in their studies, of their travels to distant lands to spread the word of God. But the longer the absences persisted, the harder it became for the community to ignore the growing suspicion that something far darker was at play. By the winter of 1877, there had been at least 8 missing children from Cedar Creek. What had started as a few isolated incidents now seemed to be a pattern. Yet the townspeople continued to turn a blind eye, trusting in the reputation of Margaret Wilson and the Methodist Church. After all, how could such a respected institution be capable of anything sinister? Behind the scenes, a carefully orchestrated system was in place. Margaret Wilson had created a network that extended far beyond Cedar Creek. With the help of her assistant, Sarah Coleman, and the financial backing of Robert Hayes, a prosperous businessman and major donor to the church, the disappearances were part of something much larger. The children who vanished were not simply lost. They were being systematically sold. Margaret Wilson, having built a reputation as a leader in the Methodist educational movement, had carefully cultivated connections with industrial and domestic labor markets. Children, particularly those from struggling families, were deemed expendable in the eyes of these networks. The fact that many of the families involved were either immigrants, widows, or working-class families meant that their children were not likely to be missed immediately. And once the children were sent away on excursions, no one would think to ask questions. Robert Hayes, with his extensive business dealings in the coal and grain industries, was able to facilitate the transportation of children across state lines. He used his connections within the railroad system to ensure that the children were moved discreetly, avoiding any scrutiny from law enforcement or town officials. The money made from selling these children was laundered through legitimate business operations, giving the conspirators the means to continue their work in relative safety. By March 1878, Ellen Hartwell had begun to unravel the threads of this horrific conspiracy. As a temporary substitute teacher, she had been instructed to manage the Sunday school program while Sarah Coleman recovered from illness. But Ellen's professional training and background soon led her to notice the glaring gaps in the children's records. She requested access to detailed lesson plans and communication logs with families, only to find that the information was being systematically withheld. When she began to ask questions about the missing children, the responses from the church's leadership were vague and evasive. Her investigation led her to a chilling discovery one fateful night when she broke into Margaret Wilson's office. There, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, Ellen uncovered a ledger that detailed every child who had gone missing over the course of 2 years. The ledger was meticulously kept, with each child listed by name, age, family background, and a price tag for their sale. What Ellen found was not just a list of names, but an entire criminal enterprise, one that had been operating under the guise of religious education. Children were being sold to factories, mines, and even private homes, with their fates sealed by their perceived value. The ledger revealed that Timothy Morrison, Mary Catherine Phillips, and dozens of other children had been sold into forced labor, some to factories in Chicago, others to domestic service in Louisville. Each transaction was logged, with prices fluctuating based on the child's perceived potential. It was a horrifying system, driven by the greed of the church's leadership, and it had been allowed to continue unchecked for far too long. As Ellen Hartwell stood in the dimly lit office of Margaret Wilson, the weight of what she had uncovered began to sink in. The ledger, now resting heavily in her hands, contained more than just names and prices. It was a testament to the horror that had been perpetuated under the guise of education. It was clear to her now. This was not merely a matter of missing children. This was a well-organized criminal network that had used Cedar Creek as a gateway for human trafficking. Ellen's first instinct was to rush to the local authorities, but she knew better. Cedar Creek was a small town, and many of its prominent residents, including Robert Hayes, were deeply involved in the operation. The financial contributions Hayes had made to the church, along with his business interests, ensured that he held significant influence. Ellen feared that even if the authorities did act, they might be easily swayed by the church's power and wealth, or worse, silenced altogether. Her mind raced as she formulated a plan. She would need to go beyond Cedar Creek, beyond the town's borders, if she had any hope of exposing this criminal operation. The journal she had found, detailing Sarah Coleman's disturbing manipulations, was another crucial piece of evidence. It revealed the psychological tactics used to control the children and convince them that their families had abandoned them, making the whole system of exploitation even more insidious. But Ellen's role in this investigation would not be easy. As she carefully hid the ledger and all the documents she had discovered, she knew the stakes had grown higher. She had become a target. Ellen had no idea how deep this conspiracy ran, nor who might be willing to protect it. Ellen's anxiety grew as she watched the days pass. The townspeople continued to look the other way, blindly trusting their leaders, while the church maintained its facade of sanctity. But Ellen could not ignore what she had found. She knew she could not remain silent. The lives of these children depended on her, and if she failed to act, they would be lost forever. On the evening of March 15th, 1878, Ellen made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She broke into the church basement once more, not to gather evidence, but to steal it. She knew that Margaret Wilson and Robert Hayes would soon realize the ledger was missing, and the final excursion would be on its way. This was the last chance to stop it before more children were lost. With trembling hands, Ellen took the ledger, the correspondence, and Sarah's journal. She knew her actions would bring immediate danger to herself, but she had no other choice. The clock was ticking, and she had no idea how much time she had before the conspirators made their escape. Ellen made a dash to the county seat in Noblesville, where she met with Judge William Marshall, a man she hoped would take her evidence seriously. She presented the documents in full, detailing the names, transactions, and evidence of the human trafficking operation. The weight of the truth was now in his hands. Judge Marshall's response was swift. He immediately sent telegrams to law enforcement in Chicago, Louisville, and several other key cities. Ellen's evidence confirmed the fears that had been gnawing at her for weeks. The conspiracy was much larger than anyone had imagined. The operation had a network that stretched across multiple states, connecting to criminal organizations that had been trafficking children for years. The investigation had reached critical mass. It was time for action. The raids were coordinated in secret, and on March 30th, 1878, a team of law enforcement officers, led by Judge Marshall, stormed the church basement. What they found was far worse than anyone had anticipated. The basement was a hub of horrors, a place where the children's fates had been sealed with meticulous care. Ellen had already discovered a few of the secrets, but the reality was even darker than she could have imagined. The rooms were filled with documents, records, and correspondence that revealed the full scope of the criminal operation. Children's personal details were cataloged, with their future work assignments written in cold, clinical terms. There were also detailed contracts with industrial operations and domestic service agencies that would use the children for labor. The network was more extensive than anyone had thought, with powerful connections in major cities throughout the Midwest. The arrest of Margaret Wilson, Sarah Coleman, and Robert Hayes sent shockwaves through the community. They had been the trusted pillars of Cedar Creek, and their downfall shattered the town's moral foundation. The investigation, which had been ignited by Ellen's courage, uncovered a web of criminal activity that had spanned over 2 years and affected dozens of innocent lives. As the conspirators were taken into custody, the community was forced to confront the harsh reality of what had been happening right under their noses. Cedar Creek's Methodist Church, once the town's pride and joy, had become the breeding ground for one of the most systematic and terrifying criminal enterprises in American history. The deception had been so carefully orchestrated that no one had questioned the sudden disappearance of so many children. The legal proceedings were intense, as evidence was presented that revealed not just the scope of the crimes, but the deep psychological manipulation involved. The children who had been trafficked were not only physically exploited, they had been emotionally and mentally conditioned to believe they had been abandoned by their families. Margaret Wilson and Sarah Coleman had created a system of psychological abuse so sophisticated that many of the children had come to accept their fate without question. The trial of the conspirators was an event that made headlines across the country. Many were horrified by the revelations, and the emotional impact on the community was profound. But as the dust settled, questions lingered. How had such a thing been allowed to happen? Why had no one noticed? The investigation revealed that Cedar Creek's leadership had failed to act, too focused on their reputations to see the truth staring them in the face. The aftermath of the Cedar Creek scandal left a scar on the town that would take generations to heal. The Methodist Church, once a beacon of hope and faith, found its reputation irrevocably damaged. The community, who had once proudly supported the church, now found themselves torn between their faith and the reality of the crimes committed in their midst. While the trial of Margaret Wilson, Sarah Coleman, and Robert Hayes brought some measure of justice, it was far from enough. The children who had been trafficked were left to pick up the pieces of their broken lives, many suffering from lifelong trauma. The families who had lost their children were left with the painful knowledge that their trust had been exploited for profit. The investigation revealed not only the horrific details of the conspiracy, but the disturbing psychology that allowed such evil to thrive. The conspirators had preyed on the vulnerable, using their aspirations and hopes for their children's futures to mask the true nature of their operation. They had used the church and the promise of education as a tool to gain trust and manipulate families into giving up their most precious possessions. As for Ellen Hotwell, she became both a hero and a pariah. Her bravery in exposing the truth came at a personal cost. The town, once her home, turned its back on her. The very people she had tried to protect now saw her as the one responsible for ruining their community's reputation. But Ellen knew the truth, and though the town might never forgive her, she could hold her head high, knowing that the children she had saved would have a chance at a better life.